Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Science of Kabbalah with your hosts, Rabbi Yitzhak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome, everyone, to another installment of the Science of Kabbalah here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. This is Rabbi Yitzhak.
And this is William Hall. How are you today, brother?
I'm doing good. It's rant day.
I have a privilege that our listeners do not have and won't ever have on this show, is that I'm looking at you in the face right now.
Are you?
See yeah, they can't see your face on this show.
Oh,
but I can.
Oh, I guess maybe
I know that's a bit unfair, but hey, what can I say?
Okay, I guess I didn't realize that I left the video on here.
Hey, it's no problem. I love seeing your face. It's the next best thing to having you here.
Okay,
So
I can't see your face, so
I
I'll have to make sure that I don't pick my nose or anything during the show.
I'm plugged in. There you go. You should be able to see me now.
Okay, well, God willing, now that I see you, you're looking good there. God willing, we'll have a good enough internet connection that it won't make a difference. And it's good that we see each other, because then maybe you won't see the smoke come off the top of my head today, because as I said, today is going to be rant day here on Israel News Talk Radio. I haven't done that in a while. It's just there's so many things going on in the world. And in a way, we shouldn't have this kind of mindset, because it's during an incredible time of the year. We're in the midst of the counting of the Omer, coming up to the Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the count of the Omer, coming up to counting towards Shavuot. But there's so many things going on in the world today. And I think it's very important, because one of the things that we hear out in the media, and not just on the media, if you're on social media, if you turn on a TV, I don't watch TV too much, because living here in Israel, it's not such a big focus for us here. But you can't turn on a website, a news website, or anything else without this concept of Wokism, this idea of people being woke. And I think about that as it relates to Torah, the idea of being awake. And of course, I always think about it relating, the thing that always comes up in my mind is the concept of, awake who slumbers from your sleep, related to the High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So there are different scriptures, there are different things related to this. I don't know how much we're going to get into Kabbalah today, but we're going to talk about the concept of Wokism versus the concept of Anti-Semitism, which is another big thing we see going on in the world today. So we have to go to a break. As soon as we come back, we're going to talk more about this here on the Science of Kabbalah, so stay with us.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzhak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to this installment, not the next week. I don't know where the heck that came from. I think we're looking at me and you side by side. I was going to get all facial expression-y just to be funny, but you're the only one seeing me, so I'll skip that. But anyway, hey, keeping it lighthearted in the beginning, because I know we're fixing to get a little bit serious in this conversation. So, usually when you hear the word rant, it usually does not involve anything that makes you excited. So we'll put the excitement out here now, and I'll tell you what that is. In our conversation that we had just now, before or in between our clips here, we're talking about Jewish food and how, people pack at the grocery stores Fridays. And I'm thinking the only experience I have is like when we traveled to go to Passover to our friend Lon's, right, in Dallas, is on the way back, we would always stop at this. They got a huge kosher H-E-B there. And it's amazing because there's so much stuff in this one place. Absolutely amazing. If we had that close by here, it would just be neat. So it brought back really neat memories of being able to do some shopping there. It was a lot of fun. So anyway, moving on to fatter things, I guess you could.
And that's kind of a good segue, because one of the things that I brought up was the idea of anti-Semitism. And so it's funny because you brought up the supermarket. I remember the first time I went to Houston, and I was with Rod Bryant in Houston going to speak at Nativ, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to take you to the supermarket. They have a lot of kosher food." And we drive up to the supermarket, and it's called Heb. And I'm like, "What the heck is that?" And he goes, "It's not Heb, it's Heb." So, but I thought that was kind of interesting for a store to be named that, because that's kind of like a not so nice name that has been used for the Jewish people over the years.
Well, what's even funnier is actually what those initials stand for.
What do they stand for?
I'm pretty sure. I'm looking it up in just a second to verify, and if I'm wrong, I'll tell you I'm wrong.
Okay.
I've always heard it actually is the guy's name is Harry, and this is Harry E. Butt, B-U-T-T.
You know that I think that's true.
I think that's true. I got to look it up now, though, because I don't want to be caught on air saying that it's not true.
Well, it's interesting when you're talking about that and the breakdown of names. There was a famous department store in New York growing up called E.J. Corvettes. The initials E.J. and Corvettes, Korvettes.
Interesting.
And that was known to stand for 8 Jewish Korean veterans that started this department store after they were in the Korean War together. It was a very popular department store when I was growing up as a kid.
So it's Howard, by the way.
It's Howard. Howard E. Butt.
It would have been funnier if it was Harry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right,
So I derailed you enough.
No. It's not a matter of derailing it. So we're kind of trying to be lighthearted here a little bit, because it's a very intense kind of subject. I was telling you off the air that a lot of this was kind of sparked by a conversation that I had with my sister. My sister lives in the U.S., and we speak twice a week on Zoom. And when I spoke to her this past week, she was just beside herself. I mean, just really beside herself over everything that's going on, everything that she sees going on in the news. And I know you don't watch the news that much, so some of the things that I mentioned to you were things that you were not up on and you were not aware of. So a lot of things have been sparked because, of course, last year during the whole COVID thing, there was an incident that took place in the United States in Minneapolis, where this man, George Floyd, was supposedly passed a bad $20 bill at a store, and the police were called. Long story short, the police subdued him. There was some question as to whether or not he was resisting arrest. And one of the officers had his knee somewhere on the back of his neck, and supposedly he kept his, not supposedly, there's video evidence that he kept his knee back there for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And as a result, this man died, and there was questions as to whether or not it was because of the knee on the neck. The autopsy showed that he had fentanyl in the system and methamphetamines, and there was all these different things. Well, but the thing is, it sparked so many riots in that area, Minneapolis, and then things didn't die down. I mean, it happened all over the country. It happened in Seattle, and it happened in Portland, and you had these, people setting up, taking over parts of the city in certain areas. And then the trial just ended like 2 weeks ago, and the officer was found guilty on all charges. And then people said, oh, well, maybe things will die down. And of course, things didn't die down. And then right after that trial and the guilty charges, then there was a shooting of a boy, 13 years old. Whether people know the facts or not, some of the things are still coming out. But he was a 13-year-old that was running from a drive-by shooting, had a gun in his hand when he was being chased by the police. And then the body cam footage shows him with his hands up in the air, and he's shot by the officer. And so there's a question of whether or not he had the gun in his hand or didn't have the gun in his hand. And so that sparked more riots. And then you had a situation like a week after that where police responded. I want to say it was in Ohio. Policemen responded to a girl with a knife that was fighting with other girls. And when he arrived, this girl that had the knife had another girl on top of a car and had the knife with her hand up in the air, getting ready to stab the girl. And within this 9 seconds, that this was taking place, the officer fired and ended up shooting her. I think she was 15 or 16 years old, and she was killed. And so this sparked even more riots. And this is all related to this whole idea of defunding the police and this whole BLM movement and all the things that are going on. And again, my sister, struggling with all these things and struggling with, as a result of all these things that are taking place, all of the craziness that we're talking about, and God forbid, chas v'shalom, that anybody should ever be hurt, a child, an adult, it doesn't matter. You never want to see one of, Hashem's children being destroyed. But there are always circumstances to this. And then this is brought in from the whole side of liberalism and socialism, that now there's always this new terminology that comes out in our vocabulary, William. So, you have this whole new word that comes out about being woke. Suddenly to be woke, that somehow people wake up to this idea of that the system has always been inherently racist, that there's this idea of systemic racism. And I know I might get in trouble for saying this, but I don't buy it. Does racism exist? Yeah, there are people that are racists. There's no question about that. But systemic racism, I don't buy it. Why? Because if there was systemic racism, this officer wouldn't have been found guilty of third-degree murder, second-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. If the system was systemically racist, then he would have gotten off, or they would have lessened the charges, or something else would have happened. And the reason why I'm ranting is because, as an Orthodox Jew, I have to sit back and watch, and maybe I don't see it so much here in this country, but then I see the anti-Semitism that's rising all over the world, especially in the U.S. You can't also open up media without seeing this. I turned on my computer this morning and went on, and I see that in the Bronx, 4 synagogues had rocks thrown through the windows outside of New York. We see Jewish people being attacked in the streets. We have it here in Israel. There have been riots in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim, for over a week now, and Arabs, young Arab people, are going out and just picking Jews off the street and beating them. Rockets are coming in from Gaza to in southern Israel. So I don't mind that people want to be upset about racism, and I don't mind that people want to be upset about children being killed in any situation. Please be upset. But at the same time, don't ignore that. Be fair. Don't ignore the fact that if you want to say that there's somehow been this systemic racism, let's talk about systemic anti-Semitism. Let's talk about the fact that some of the very groups that are standing up now, that are out there marching and rioting, like the Black Lives Matters, is one of the most anti-Semitic groups out there. That they attack Israel, that politicians attack Israel, and we can get into a whole thing here, because besides bringing my rant, I want to bring some semblance of an understanding of the Torah implications of this as well, and not just be me, yelling at the screen, seeing you sitting back there and going, whoa, he's on a roll today. But I think it's an important subject to discuss, and it's an important subject to discuss during this time, because we are in a time of counting in the Omer. We are in a time where we're taking stock of our attributes, we're taking stock of our characteristics, and saying, where we've used the analogy of weeding the garden and trying to make things right. And so there are just times where we have to get things out of our system, because getting it out of our system and ranting a little bit helps us to identify areas in ourselves, whether it's anger, whether it's pride, whether it's ego, any of those things that we can then identify in ourselves and say, okay, let me take a step back and see. So I'm trying to wake myself up to these things, but I'm also challenging other people to question, what are you accepting? What are you believing? What are you listening to? What are you seeing out in the media? Don't believe everything that you hear. Take everything with a grain of salt and then measure it against, what does Hashem say? What does the Torah say? What do our sources in Judaism say about these things, about this idea of being awake? Yeah, we all need to be awake, but we need to be awake not to buy into and to assimilate into new concepts and new cultures that are coming out, because we have a wisdom that was given to us. We're getting ready, coming at the end of this count, to remember the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So we have wisdom that was given to us thousands of years ago. We don't need to come up with new concepts today to hold on to that are going to draw us away from that. So that's the rant for section 1, for part 1 today. We're going to have to go to a break, so stay with us. We're going to be right back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzhak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Science of
I just
Kabbalah.
wanted to see what it felt like to interrupt you during an intro.
Like that? No problem.
Okay.
No problem. You lighten up the mood.
You
Since
you can't edit this part out for sure.
Since I'm on a roll already.
Anyway,
moving on. So
you brought up the thing that's something that I was kind of curious about.
Which was
anti-Semitism itself.
Yeah.
People for some reason a lot of people don't equate that with racism, but it's technically the same thing. And it's like, I don't understand. Like you mentioned earlier, it's okay to have black people retaliating white people. Not that happens. I'm not really sure how that works, but
right.
All this retaliation. But whenever you see things that happen in a Jewish community, it's like it gets swept under the rug, and that's kind of something I've always been curious about.
Yeah. So here's some of the things that kind of jumped out to me, and I see sort of interconnected, and I'm not sure that other people see this. So I brought up, for instance, this stabbing attack that took place in Ohio, and where this young girl was fighting with these other girls, and she was attacking this girl. And it's very easy to be, whatever you want to call it, an armchair quarterback or, backseat driver, or whatever they used to call people, as it relates to the media. For instance, it's very easy to say, oh, let's analyze this whole thing now. So, for instance, you have some of the main media in the U.S. was downplaying the fact that this girl actually had a knife and was getting ready to stab this other girl. And as a result of that, I said, we're seeing all these things come about. That's kind of the snowball effect of all these different shootings that have taken place. And I said, God forbid that this should ever happen. But the question that people are asking themselves now is, where am I safe? What's going to be the next business that's boarded up? What's going to happen? Am I going to be able to be safe when I go out for a walk at night? Am I going to be safe if I go out and drive my car? Am I going to be able to go and eat in a restaurant? I mean, we saw people being attacked sitting in restaurants, sitting outside and being attacked by protesters and interrupting them while they're dining because they wanted them to make whatever the Black Lives Matter sign was, in solidarity. And if they didn't do that, they were attacked. Here's the interesting connection, William, that I see. Other people sit back and wait. And I brought up the fact that now we have these riots that are taking place in Jerusalem. It's almost as if the rest of the world watches and sees what happens. And when they see that you have a weak government, like what's going on in the U.S. now, that doesn't respond and doesn't retaliate in any way to, and says, well, protest is a right. People have a right to protest. So now it's almost like these factions in Israel, these Arab terrorists, figure, well, if it's okay in America, if it's okay in the U.S., let's try it here in Israel. Let's see what happens. And let's see if the Israelis are going to do anything about it. And then you talk about this sort of connection. So you have to say, what do we learn from this? It's almost like these groups and these coalitions are sort of coming out. They have this victim mentality. I talked about this on another show some time back about, this sort of idea of being a perpetual victim. And I talked about it as it relates to the slave mentality and coming out of Mitzrayim, for instance. Somebody who's a perpetual victim and has the slave mentality is always looking for a boogeyman. They're always looking for somebody to blame, always somebody to throw it on. And the truth is that usually the people that it gets thrown on are the Jews. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen now, because you see, as a matter of fact, one of the conservative commentators, his name is Victor David Hansen. He wrote this in the National Review. He described it as an emerging new anti-Semitism. And he said this, that serves as a unifying progressive bond among marginalized groups such as young Middle Easterners, Muslims, feminists, blacks, woke celebrities and entertainers, socialists, the undocumented, and student activists. Its overt message derived from both old and new. There is the same conspiratorial idea that the Jews covertly and underhandedly exert inordinate control over Americans, but it has added a number of subtler twists, namely that the Jews are part of the old guard whose anachronistic standards of privilege block the emerging new constituency of woke Muslims, blacks, Latinos, and feminists. I mean, think about that. So basically what he's saying is it's not just that, let's blame the Jews when we don't have anybody else to blame, but now let's, on top of that, add some things. And we'll say not only can we blame the Jews like we always have, but they're also part of the old guard. And now you talk about white privilege that you throw in. It's not just white privilege now, but there's white Jewish privilege becomes a thing. And yet, when you look at the Jewish people and you go down through the centuries, we've been persecuted by the Christians for rejecting Jesus. We've been persecuted by the Muslims for rejecting Muhammad. There were places that we were denied the right to vote. We were denied the right to have citizenship. We were denied the right to own property. We were put into ghettos. We were denied admission to universities. We were rounded up and killed in pogroms in Russia, scattered to the ends of the earth, enslaved, butchered during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. And what happened? The world looked on. And yet, with all of that, then they want to lump us in and they want to throw us in with this idea of not only white privilege, but Jewish white privilege now. It's beyond crazy. And so I thought to myself, how do we connect this? We talk about this idea of being woke, being awoke, being asleep. There's a verse actually in Shir HaShirim, chapter 5, verse 2. It says, Ani yeshena v'lebi er. This idea that I sleep, but my heart is awake. And that's a very interesting concept to me, this idea of the heart, because as you know, I'm in the process of putting together notes for this new book that I want to write. And this book has to do with the heart and the concept of the heart. And we know that the heart is a seat of the emotions. And we also know that the heart, being the seat of emotions, that we're taught in the Torah that we have to circumcise the foreskin of our hearts. And a lot of it with this idea of emotion, this idea of ego, this connection to the heart. As a matter of fact, the heart is said to be a place where both the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov, both the evil inclination and the good inclination dwells. And famously, we see that in the commentary on the Shema. When we go into the second part of the Shema, after we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and when we say the V'ahavta, this idea of you love God, what? Livavavcha, with all your heart, it's got two bits. It's got a double bit in that talking about your heart. And they say, why are there the two beit in that? For the Yetzer Hara and for the Yetzer Tov. So this idea of being asleep and awake is a very powerful concept. Now, there's also a Gemara in Pesachim that I wanted to bring up. Why do I bring that up? Because a lot of what's going on in the world today is propagated by people that are supposed to be not awake or woke the way people want to describe it today, but they should be awake because they're supposed to be intelligent people. They're supposed to be educated people. We're talking about politicians, and we're talking about politicians who are Jewish, and yet they buy into a lot of these things. So there's a Gemara in Pesachim 49b, page B, and it says this. It says, Gidola sina shesonin ami haaretz letamid chacham yoter misina shesonin umot olam et Yisrael. So it starts off saying that the hatred which ignoramuses have for a Torah scholar is greater than the hatred that the nations of the world have for the Jewish people. And before it says this in Pesachim, it actually, interestingly enough, has the rabbi's opinions of what we should do to an ignoramus, what we can do to an ignoramus, how to punish this ignoramus. And then it goes on and it says that it goes on towards the end of that one that I just read, that verse that I just read, it says it was taught, and it's talking in a Tosefta, that a person who basically studied the Torah, who knows it and understands it, and then left it, is worse than all of them. That he hates the Talmid Chacham, the Torah scholar, more than all of them. And so this is where you come in with this whole concept of self-hating Jews, where you have politicians like Bernie Sanders that will stand with somebody like Rashid Tlaib, who's a virulent anti-Semite, who's a congresswoman, who stands with that whole squad that attack Israel, that are against Israel, that want to cut off aid to Israel. Elizabeth Warren, not that she's Jewish, although I'm surprised, they called her Pocahontas because she claimed to be a Native American. I'm surprised she hasn't told us at some point that, she's, a Bat Kohen. She comes up with all kinds of other lies. People like Chuck Schumer, Jerry Nadler, all these people that are in politics that are Jewish people that buy into these lies. It makes me crazy. So this idea of being awake, of being woke, you want to wake up to the fact that we have this wisdom that I said for 3,000 years. It really is supposed to be the guiding light for us. And this is the thing that we're supposed to do. We have to watch what we take in. So when we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And thank God we only have another 12 minutes for me to rant about this. So stay with us. We're going to be back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah and Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzchak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to our final segment on Israel News Talk Radio here, the Science of Kabbalah. So you've heard so far about all this racism and anti-Semitism, and so it's really a hurtful thing. It didn't used to bother me because I wasn't ever really subjected to it. Growing up, where I grew up at, I had my best friend was a black football player, pardon me, and we played football together. In fact, he's the one that broke my tooth off in a football game, and so we didn't really have any of that in the area I was raised in, and even around here. For example, my son-in-law is actually black. He's a full-blood black guy. Love him, nicest guy on the planet, man. And so I'm not really so used to seeing it here, but whenever you hear about it on the news, it not only like confuses the crap out of me, but it just also just makes me almost a little pretty upset about it, especially when we're talking about just overall racism and anti-Semitism. And now that I have joined myself here, not by conversion yet, but I've joined myself in my heart and soul with the Jewish people as a Ben Noach right now. When I hear stuff about anti-Semitism and see this stuff, it really just it burns me up so bad. It's like I don't even know how to process that information.
Right, and I think one of the reasons why people get so upset, and like I was mentioning my sister, and why this upsets me is because this whole concept of this talking about white privilege. You and I have talked about our pasts. You grew up very poor. I grew up very poor. To say anything that you and I grew up with was privilege was ridiculous, saying that somehow we were more privileged because we were white. As a matter of fact, and I don't say this to try to prove any kind of point, but I can tell you that when I went to college, when I first went to college, I could not afford to go. My parents could not afford to pay for me to go to college. I had to work 2 jobs in order to afford tuition. And yet I would see people, minorities, getting their tuitions paid for them, their books paid for them, and they would be sitting outside, cutting classes, smoking pot out on the grass or whatever. And I was having to work 2 jobs and ended up having to quit school and not get my degree. Back then, I had to go back to school at a later time because I couldn't afford it. So if there was any kind of privilege, it was just the opposite. For instance, let me go into some of the facts here, okay? Related to the difference. There's a website for a documentary film that's called From Swastika to Jim Crow. And the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League were central to the campaign against racial prejudice. If you look back we were just talking about the 60s, and I was telling you about the show that I was watching about the 60s and the rise of Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X and so forth. During that same period, Jews were the one who were making substantial contributions to many of the civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, the Urban League, the Congress of Racial Equality. About 50% of the civil rights attorneys in the South during the 1960s were Jews, as were over 50% of the whites who went to Mississippi in 1964 to challenge the Jim Crow laws. And a lot of people don't know that Rav Heschel actually marched. If you look at all the Jews that marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., okay, and what did he say? He said he didn't judge man by the color of skin, but the content of his character. But if you say that today to somebody, I actually saw somebody post today, a Jewish friend of mine posted, that he posted that quote and somebody sent him an email and called him a racist, quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Wow. No kidding. Holy cow.
Right. So when you think about it, if you want to say that at the time there was systemic racism or institutionalized racism when I was growing back in the 60s, absolutely. But the Jews were at the forefront of fighting that. And yet something else completely going on. Alan Dershowitz, Professor Alan Dershowitz, in talking about this idea of people blaming the Jews and Israel for everybody's woes, he talked about this, and he talked about that recently there was a platform issued where more than 60 groups that form the core of the Black Lives Matter movement went out of their way to single out one particular foreign nation to accuse them of genocide and apartheid. Okay, now you would think maybe it would be a government like Syria, which has killed tens of thousands of their own people, of innocent people. Or you could think maybe it's Saudi Arabia, which openly practices gender and religious apartheid. Or maybe it was Iran that hangs homosexuals and murders dissidents. And interestingly enough, the UN, okay, the United Nations recently added one of those countries to the Women's Rights Commission. Who was it? Iran. They have the worst record on women's rights in the world, and the UN added them to the Women's Rights Commission. It wasn't China, although they've occupied Tibet for more than half a century. It wasn't Turkey, which imprisons journalists, judges, and professors. And it wasn't the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, where there, if you get arrested, the police basically are judge, jury, and executioner. What country was it, do you ask, William? You already know the answer to it, okay? It was Israel, the state of the Jewish people, and the only democracy of all of those countries that we talked about. That's who the core groups of this Black Lives Matter movement claims is a foreign nation that they accuse of genocide and apartheid.
Unbelievable.
And yet, we talk about this idea of victimhood and so forth. Israel's Arab enemies are victims of their own moral choices. Because if you think about it, they've been offered deals from 1948, even back in 1948. Hey, you want a two-state solution? We'll have this area, you have this area. No, what happened? All of the surrounding countries, the leaders of the surrounding countries said, no, you know what? All you Arabs that live in here, leave, because we're going to destroy the Jewish people, and then you'll be able to move back and there'll be no problem, annihilate them, and everything will be done. But Hashem had another plan. And no matter what they've been offered, year after year after year after year, giving them every opportunity to have a fair and a peaceful settlement between the Jewish people and the Arabs, they've chosen to not accept that. So really, at the end of the day, if being awake or being woke, like this word, I can't stand that word, woke.
It doesn't even roll off the tongue very well.
It doesn't. And we talk about this idea, of course, especially during this time that we're talking about the Omer, it's about this idea of having our consciousness raised. We want a consciousness raised to have a consciousness raised towards Hashem. But you're trying to say that this concept of being woke is sort of having one's consciousness raised. Then my thing is, how about everybody wake up, walk to your closest mirror, take a deep, hard look at yourself, and instead of blaming the Jews, blame yourself. Because everybody, instead of saying that there's this problem and there's that problem, take advantage of the privileges that are available, that they're open to all people in order to achieve your goals. Wake up to this idea that you're not a victim, that you don't need to be a perpetual victim, that you don't need to consider yourself a perpetual slave. Wake up and thank the Jewish people who have given so much to the world, the leaders in technology. If you realize that the very things that you live on today, your cell phone, the technology comes from Israel. Most of the people that are anti-Semites today, if they realized that in sickness, if they went to the hospital, that most of the treatment, that technology came from Israel, would they reject it and say, no, I don't want it because some Jew came up with the idea?
Right.
It's crazy. Wake up to this false sense of being a victim. Wake up and thank the Jewish people. Thank the Jewish people for the fact that you've been given wisdom. And if you're a Jewish person, wake up to the fact that you were given this wisdom 3,000 years ago, that you also don't need to be a victim, that you also, because this idea of circumcising our hearts goes past just circumcising our hearts. It goes to the idea of circumcising our lips and circumcising our ears. We're told to circumcise our ears as well. So stop listening to all the voices that are coming out with shtuyot, with nonsense. And be careful about the things that pass by your lips. Don't just parrot the things that you hear. Don't blame Israel for something that you know nothing about. Don't join in with the throng of people that are simply wrong. And don't buy in to this idea of this new anti-Semitism. Wake up to the fact that this is terrible disgusting in the same way that racism is disgusting. The whole idea of this new anti-Semitism is disgusting as well. Wake up and don't allow anybody to put you back to sleep. Wake up, you sleepers, from your slumber. There are too many people that are sleeping, William. So, I mean, that's really my rant for today. I needed to get this out of my system because I need to get back to this idea of focusing on the Omer, focusing on coming into Lag BaOmer, a joyous time, observing and celebrating the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and then coming into Shavuot with the giving of this beautiful wisdom and disseminating this wisdom so that people really do wake up to the wisdom of Torah and we do transform the world to a real tikkun olam, not the fake social justice of the liberal left, but real tikkun olam, repair of the world, so that we see Hashem come and be in our midst again. That's all the time we have for today, my friend.
No problem. Thanks for spending the time here with me too. And I love seeing the video. Like I said, it really kind of makes me connect a little bit more. That's good. Glad you had your camera on today.
Yep. And thank you for listening to me for the last hour. Thank you, everybody else, for staying with us each week here on the Science of Kabbalah. We'll see you next week. Be well.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.